Thank you. So I'd like to start by thanking the conveners, especially Maria, for inviting me to speak. This is a great pleasure to be here virtually with you all. This is my first virtual paper, although I've been doing a lot of online teaching, so hopefully I've got a bit of a hand at this. I want to start with two caveats, as my papers often do. The first is that a caveat that I think applies to everybody right now, which is that I've not had the time or the resources to put into this paper that I would have liked to have done. As Maria alluded to, I'm a director of teaching for the department, and that's certainly been an interesting time. There have been moments in the last couple of weeks when I have wondered about the wisdom of trying to give a paper at this particular moment in our teaching term, but actually I'm really pleased that it's happening now, and it's been a real pleasure to revisit the research and get back into some of that thinking that's not about administrative firefighting. So again, my thanks to the seminar conveners for giving me this opportunity. The other caveat is really entirely my own fault, although I can also blame it on those other circumstances, which is that I'm not very well versed in the kind of theoretical side of the study of the life cycle. It's a concept I've come across in research and reading, but I've never really spent time focusing on it. So I would welcome suggestions to correct my ignorance and foolishness that is no doubt going to become manifest in this paper, both through the speed with which it has been put together and the fact that I'm not really a bona fide historian of the life cycle. But what I've tried to do in this talk is reflect about how taking a kind of life cycle perspective, or thinking about the stages of life, can help us to understand the experiences of early modern seafarers, which is the main area of my research, as Maria has said. And so I suppose I should start by highlighting why I think seafarers are interesting, and then I'll kind of touch a bit on the historiography around them before moving on to look at some two particular themes: seafarers in their careers and seafarers and communities. And I should also apologize to those of you who've heard various versions of some of this before, because I know this will be familiar to some of the people in the room. So one of the reasons that I'm interested in seafarers in the early modern period is that they form a very distinctive occupational group. They were supposedly recognizable at the time. They walked, talked, dressed differently to other people. And this raises all kinds of interesting social history questions about those communities that they inhabited, the distinctness of those communities, the connections with other groups ashore. But there's also a wider dimension that I'm interested in them, which is their role in the commercial and imperial networks that developed through the early modern period and really transformed the world in this period. So the connections and interactions between different parts of the globe, which only really happen because of the labor of maritime workers. So there's a wider significance beyond their intrinsic value as well. So to touch on the historiography of seafarers, this is an image that some of you will have seen in previous papers of mine, because this guy appears in almost every paper I give at the moment, because it's such a nice illustration of some of the themes I'm talking about. From a life cycles sort of perspective, or thinking about the stages of seafarers' lives, most historians, and I hope everyone will forgive me for simplifying here, especially those who've written this history who are here, but most historians have tended to accept the idea that most seafarers were young, that this was something that coincided with youth or early adulthood. And this has tied into other assumptions about seafarers' behavior, about them being loose and carefree, about them being isolated from wider society in some ways, about them being drunk or violent or sexually promiscuous, which is why I particularly like the image on screen right now. He looks a bit grizzled, so not such a young person, but he captures all the other themes about seafaring that were stereotypes that existed at the time. They existed in the early modern period and have continued to be very appealing to historians because they are very interesting. So one contemporary commentator, a sailor himself, said that sailors were the very scum and offscouring in England of most men. This is just a taste of many comments of that type, explaining how the ideas around seafarers. Now, many scholars have criticized these ideas, have suggested more interesting and nuanced interpretations of seafaring and seamen and their experiences. But they have a remarkable hold, not least because of their existence in the period itself. And so in my work, I've been trying not only to criticize these stereotypes and explore what seafarers' experiences were really like, as well as the kind of stereotypical image, but also to think about their significance, because these seafarers were aware of the stereotypes about them, and sometimes they contributed to the stereotypes about them. And so I think it's important that while we look beyond images like this one, we also recognize the power that they held for the people that we are focusing on in practice. And so from a sort of life cycle perspective, the key element is that they were generally young men, but that this has all sorts of other ideas about their behaviors as well. Now, this was had some basis in fact, and these assumptions about the age of seafarers tie in with other ideas about maritime life in this period. So one of the reasons people thought that seafarers were generally quite young is because of the dangers of the sea, nicely illustrated by an example of the Dutch Golden Age art here, which again, a theme that appears in many, many paintings across this period. Not just the proverbial natural hazards, which we can see illustrated here, but also things like illness and injury, and also pirates and warfare. Conflict at sea was very endemic in this period, and seafarers were generally expected to encounter violence and conflict as part of their journeys. So one reason why seafaring is often taken to be associated with the sort of youth stage of life is because seafarers may not have lived much longer than that because of all of these issues. But another important dimension is that there were many temporary seafarers as well. So while historians have often focused on the ocean going, the deep sea voyages as some of the most interesting examples, actually probably the majority of people working on ships were working on small coastal voyages, on short trips, short crossings across the North Sea or the Mediterranean, in the fisheries as well. And that's one reason why I picked this image, because it shows a fishing boat. So, oh, excuse me. So those, for those sailors, many of them would have alternated between seafaring and other seasonal work, or they would have gone to sea for a few years in their youth and then moved on to work in other sectors as well. And that is true of longer voyages as well. The transoceanic voyages often also had people aboard who would only be going to sea for a few years and then moving on. So this supports the idea that seafaring is associated with the sort of youth and early adulthood stages of the life cycle, but it's very difficult to get much further than that in the records because they rarely distinguish between sort of professional career seafarers and temporary seafarers. Part of the power of the stereotypes that I was referring to is anyone who worked at sea was considered a seaman in English or a cognate in other languages. And although some governments did try to distinguish because it was useful for their military purposes and for economic purposes to have the experienced seafarers on hand when they needed them, many of the records simply don't distinguish. So it's very difficult for us to identify in many cases. But we can say that many of the seafarers did, as the stereotype suggests, go to sea early in their lives and for the part of youth, and that may have brought some of those other assumptions. So I promised graphs on Twitter. I have 2 graphs in the paper to satisfy those who are here just for the graphs. This is actually from my PhD research, which is quite a while ago now, but it's a breakdown of age of maritime deponents in the Admiralty Court, which is what I did a lot of my PhD research on. And this does broadly confirm that stereotype that we were talking about the youth. So you can see, I hope the cursor is visible, you can see the kind of spike, particularly for the category mariner, which I'm using here to mean someone who's not got a specialist position aboard ship. So what contemporaries would have called common seamen or ordinary seamen. But we can also see a very interesting kind of tail that's much larger than the stereotype would necessarily suggest, particularly amongst the other officers, which is what I've called them in my PhD, or specialists. So these are people like carpenters and gunners, boatswains, people who have extra responsibilities aboard ship. And then we also have these commanding officers, which is the sort of long dash line. And again, we can see particularly for them, the peak is much longer and rises later in life. This is only one snapshot from one period that I did my PhD on, but it is from a very busy period in the court's history. So it does give us quite a full piece of information. I know that the Marine Lives Project, some of whom I think may well be in the audience, have also been gathering much larger data sets, so more analysis on this could be pursued, but I suspect that these patterns would hold in the larger analysis as well. And I don't think it's a great surprise that the people holding greater responsibility aboard ship were at later stages of their life cycle. But I think it is interesting that it shows up so clearly in the data. And I think that that longer tail, including for the ordinary sailors as well, is a really interesting element. And the kind of point here is that we have to explore those other stages of the life cycle in more detail than just focusing on seafarers as potentially young workers. Now, one of the issues with the Admiralty Court records is that many of the sailors who appear in those records appear just in one case or only a few times. And so it's very difficult to build up a picture of these seafarers across their lives. And that's true of many lower status individuals in this period of history in any case. But we get snapshots, we get moments with their lives, but only in a few cases can we construct a sort of longer history, which makes it harder to think about these stages of life as we're doing today. Luckily, two seafarers wrote autobiographies during the 17th century. Both of them happened to be called Edward Barlow and Edward Coxery. And my current book project began as a sort of broader social history using things like the Admiralty Court and other sources, but has increasingly got just drawn into focusing on these two seafarers and their autobiographies. Partially because I'm quite interested in the methodology of global microhistory, which has been discussed in a few places recently. And I think this idea of kind of repersonalizing the vast global scales of global history is a very interesting approach. So that's one reason why I'm kind of taking this slightly more focused case study. But also these two autobiographies are absolutely unique in giving us an insight into these experiences of these men across the different stages of their lives, because both men write a journal covering almost the entirety of their adult lives. And as part of that, I've become increasingly interested in their autobiographies themselves and the practices of writing. And I know there are people in the room who've shared that interest, and I've had lots of conversations with, but about how these seafarers, to go back to that question of stereotypes, about how these seafarers were shaping their own stories through these documents and the kind of practice of doing that, and how they reflected on their own lives and experiences. And that's part of what I think is so interesting about these documents. This is an image from Edward Barlow, which is held at the National Maritime Museum. Both of them are very interestingly and beautifully illustrated. This is the image that tends to turn up in my papers because it entertains me a great deal. Some of you might remember that there was a 400-year-old shark found in the Atlantic not long ago. I do wonder if this is the same shark, but I'm not sure we'll ever be able to prove that. But the drawings and the illustrations are also an interesting element of these seafarers' autobiographies. So Edward Barlow in particular wrote and reflected on sort of his life as he went along in the journal. And he was particularly negative about a lot of things, but including about growing old as a seafarer, to go back to that theme that I'm sort of raising here. He said that to be an old common seaman, so to be a sailor of the kind of lower rank, was no better than slavery. And he was particularly unhappy about the idea. He was writing when he was younger, but thinking about becoming old. And he was particularly unhappy about the idea of being called an old dog and an old rogue. And he'd sort of seen these insults being used of sailors, and he thought it was very disrespectful. So that might kind of fit in with this concept of sailors as more youthful and the older sailors as something of an unpleasant outlier. Although it's really important that we acknowledge that Barlow's purpose in writing his journal was to dissuade other people from going to sea. And he says that quite explicitly at various stages. And the context in which he starts writing his journal is when he's imprisoned by the Dutch in Indonesia as part of one of the Anglo-Dutch wars, which may not have been conducive to a positive outlook on life as he was writing. And about the first half of his journal is written from memory while he's imprisoned in Indonesia. So that casts a kind of particular tone over most of the document. And it's also worth noting that although Barlow is negative, he returns to sea himself repeatedly. And actually he spends half a century almost as a sailor going back to sea. He calls it his trade. And both Barlow and Coxery rise through the ranks of seafaring and eventually command their own ships, which may reflect in the fact that they chose to write their journals as well, that they had these longer maritime careers. So that in itself throws some questions about Barlow's self-avowed dislike of growing old at sea, given that he himself had quite a lot of success. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the paper is kind of explore these two themes of seafarers and career and seafarers and community as they appear in these two sailors' autobiographies. So we're about halfway through, by the way, if anyone's worried about time. Both Barlow and Coxery touch on this idea of being youthful at sea and reflect on their early experiences. This is a really nice image from the Rijksmuseum of a young sailor. Barlow left home at 12 and went to sea probably at about the age of 13 or 14. Coxery first traveled at 14 and probably became a sailor about the age of 15. Both of them spent quite a while working in the lower ranks of ship's hierarchies. So Coxeter about 7 years and Barlow about 15 years. And so both of them had quite a long experience of kind of being common sailors and being young sailors. And that shows up in some ways in line with the stereotype that I referred to earlier. So, for example, on one occasion, Barlow was out on a naval ship with a fleet, and his ship was being sent home. And so he swapped with some other sailors to other ships because the other sailors wanted to go home to their families, but he wanted to stay out and carry on seafaring. So that idea of being kind of more isolated and distinct from communities ashore at the earlier stage may well have some validity. Coxeter is even more explicit in his journal, writing that he spent my time amongst the wildest sort of people and called himself wild, being left to my own range amongst other nations and people besides my own. And he recorded how he and his shipmates took large liberty when ashore in drinking and sporting, as the manner of seamen generally is. So he kind of endorses the stereotype of youthful indiscretions that associates with seafarers. Barlow, by contrast, interestingly, claims that he himself never liked tippling or fuddling and only ever did it for love of company, not because he enjoyed it himself. That's my excuse as well. So both of them kind of do go through that stage that's fairly well documented with the stereotypes. But as I said, both of them progress. And I think the really important image that emerges from these autobiographies is just how this is a really dynamic situation, that as career seafarers are returning to sea again and again, they don't remain in that sort of one stage of existence, and the circumstances change, and their careers, their sort of professional aspects reflect the different stages of their life cycle quite strongly. So both of them rise first to be specialists, and then to hold special responsibilities as carpenters or gunners or boatswains, and then on to become commanding officers. And actually formal education, as other scholars have shown, only plays a limited role in this. There are institutions for education of things like navigation, which I'll come back to in a minute, but a lot of this is about experience. A lot of this is about on-the-job training. Barlow actually spends about 6 or 7 years as an apprentice before he kind of moves up to being a common sailor and then further. But he is very dismissive of this experience. He says that his master did but show me little concerning navigation, and although his master was supposed to learn me the mariner's art, he did not strive much to show me, although Barlow does add, nor I much to learn, which I think is quite a significant comment about his attitudes, and might explain why it took him longer than Coxeter to rise if he wasn't putting in the effort early on to acquire that experience. Coxeter is interesting because he doesn't serve an apprenticeship. He clearly just acquires experience and practical skills while working on ships. But he actually goes to sea first on Dutch ships. And so he first learns how to sail in Dutch, and then he later transfers to English ships and he writes about learning all the English words and having to start again and learn the English techniques and the English practices. So the kind of importance of the practical expertise, the experience at sea to career progression, I think chimes in with this picture we see with the life cycle, where it does take several years to acquire this kind of experience of practical training. Both of them also learn how to navigate, and both of them are actually very proud of their ability to navigate. They both boast about being capable navigators in their journals later on, and you really have to be able to navigate to attain the higher ranks of the shipping hierarchy. And again, there are some institutions for learning navigation. Margaret Schotter has done some absolutely excellent work on this recently. I think I saw you earlier, Margaret, on the chat, and also Mordecai Levy-Eichel looking at sort of mathematical research. So they've shown that sailors were learning to navigate and learning mathematics on the ships using things like navigational textbooks and teachers. So there's some kind of formal element of it, but also, a lot of practical knowledge as well. And so for both of these sailors, there is that kind of, there's no sort of certificate necessarily to say that you're a skilled navigator. There are some specific contexts, but in most cases, it's simply your experience and your ability that is qualifying you. Which, as I said, probably explains the age patterns that we were looking at earlier, where it takes several years to acquire this experience. And it's important, this is not just experience of navigation and mathematical techniques, but also things like knowledge of the maritime environment. Barlow makes a lot of comments about natural phenomena, presumably for future reference. And later on in his career, he serves as a pilot on East India Company ships because he knows the voyage to Canton very well, and he knows the harbour very well. And so it's that practical experience, almost the physical experience of the maritime environment, which contributes to this career progression, as well as the kind of technical learning that seafarers are acquiring. Now, seafarer scholars have, I think, often focused on the kind of distinction between the ship captain on the one hand as the height of the hierarchy and ordinary sailors on the other hand as the kind of rank and file. And I think one of the reflections I take away from this approach is that we need to think more about the intermediate ranks as being really important to the ship's hierarchy, but also to the life cycle of the seafarers and the stages. Both Barlow and Coxery spend almost a decade as officers, and then more than a decade as chief mate, which is the sort of second in command of the ship. Barlow spends 2 decades as ship chief mate. Coxery spends almost a decade as chief mate. So that's a large chunk of their adult life where they are occupying this position on the ship, where they are carrying out these roles. And I think it has a big impact, not just because of their position in the hierarchy, but also because of the kind of material opportunities that it gives them access to. So this is from an article that I published a few years ago looking at sailors' wages. What you can see here is that the middle line is the median point. These grey bands represent 50% of the sample, so that's the majority almost, and then these kind of stragglers represent the outliers. So you have to imagine it as a sort of a D curve turned on its side, with the majority of the concentration within these grey bands. And what we see is that if you rise to be a specialist like a carpenter or a gunner, you can earn twice as much as a normal mariner. If you become a master's mate, you can earn 3 times as much as a normal mariner, although there are also lots of variations within the individual categories, which you can see represented on these outliers as well. But so by progressing up this hierarchy, you're really transforming the material circumstances, certainly in economic terms, of your career. And also because the research that we did on the project for that article and other research by people like Beverly Lemire and Maria Fusaro shows that seafarers' earnings are not just about the wages that they are earning, but also about opportunities to trade and to participate in relatively small scale trade. But some seafarers are earning quite a lot on top of their wages by bringing back goods in their cabins and then trading them with their communities at home. And so it's the access to those networks of trade that come with higher ranks. Barlow, once he's a chief mate in the East India Company, he engaged in a lot of trade, even though it's technically prohibited by the company, but he does it anyway. And it's because of the kind of expertise, the technical, practical expertise that these seafarers have that kind of gives them access to these opportunities. Coxery, both men do eventually rise to become captain of ships as well, to the very top. Barlow dies on the voyage where he becomes captain because the ship sinks, which is rather sad. Coxery, in an interesting dimension, becomes a shipmaster, but then decides that it's all too much for him, all the additional responsibility, and just buys a small ship called Ahoy and just goes back to doing coastal trade. So he is earning a lot and working at the top of the hierarchy, but he decides in his old age that he doesn't want to continue doing that. So that also complicates, I think, some of the ideas about the later stage of the life cycle that we might think about, where it doesn't necessarily move in a single direction. These seafarers might make different choices based on their circumstances. And that links to the second theme, which is the remainder of the paper, which I hope I'm allowed to just carry on and continue with your patience, which is about seafaring communities. Because one of the things I really want to explore is the link between seafarers' communities and their careers. The seafarers at sea and seafarers on land are not totally divided as they have sometimes been represented to be. So both, so what I want to the point I want to make in this section of the paper is that the relationships with families, with friends, with neighbors persist throughout the life cycle of these seafarers, but also shift, unsurprisingly, as they go through and obtain different meanings at different points in their lives. This is an illustration from Barlow's journal from when he leaves his family home, and it shows his mother waving to him, calling to him to come back, and it's clearly an emotional moment that he's chosen to illustrate it so beautifully. But the importance does not disappear at this point. Barlow goes back to visit his family quite a few times and maintains in contact with his family. And often it shows up when members of his family die, and he says, oh, the grief was terrible. So the emotional attachment is often only thrown into relief by losing family members, but it remains throughout his life. Coxery, similarly, once was on a voyage and was about to undertake a very promising opportunity, but another man from Dover, which is where Coxery came from, told him that his mother wasn't very well, and he rushes home to see his mum rather than go on the profitable voyage. So the kind of importance of these family networks, I think, is really worth highlighting, not just because they persist throughout the careers, but also because they shape the seafarers' activities at sea. So particularly in that early stage, they're very important for opening up these seafaring careers. Coxery's father and brother were both sailors, which probably explains why he went into shipping himself. Barlow's family were farmers, but his uncle was an innkeeper in London and had a friend in the Navy office and sets up an apprenticeship for Barlow through the Navy office. So it's thanks to his uncle that he has that connection. And then while he's an apprentice, Barlow's master and mistress act as a kind of surrogate family. He lives with them when he's at home in London. There are some tensions in that family. It's not entirely happy, but they do genuinely seem to care for Barlow and to try and support him in that early stage. So I think the importance of those kinds of parent and sibling and surrogate relationships are very important in the early stages of seafarers' careers. Later on, the seafarers become fathers and husbands themselves. And this is from a ballad from the Broadside Ballad Archive, where there are many, many, many ballads about sailors and their sweethearts from across this period. So that idea of sailors being totally isolated is kind of contradicted by the wealth of evidence of people singing about the idea, at least the idea of seafarers in these kinds of relationships. Admittedly, this is one that ends happily. Many of the ballads end unhappily when the sailor doesn't come back from sea, or the wife goes off and commits adultery, or the sailor turns out to have 5 other wives. So there is a diversity of experiences represented in these ballads, but quite a lot of them do show a kind of constancy, as the title here says, and kind of celebrate the faithfulness of the partners in the relationship. So both Edward Barlow and Edward Coxery married, both married women called Mary, in another nice piece of symmetry. Coxery marries someone from Dover, and his brother-in-law, his new brother-in-law, is a shipmaster, and then Coxery starts sailing with his new brother-in-law. So again, we see this overlap between the family and the shipping interests. But also I think the local community is really important. Coxery travels quite widely, but he always comes back to Dover, and he marries in Dover, and he seems to remain based in Dover. So I think the local neighbourhood is a really important context there as well. And one of the interesting things that Coxery writes is that when recounting his marriage, he says, "Now, as to my married condition, where I was gotten into, care began to creep in, which before I was unacquainted with." And I think that's a really curious statement about how his responsibilities have changed, his ideas have changed, his behavior has changed as part of this changing relationship at home. Indeed, both men write about their wives with a lot of affection, but here it starts to get very complicated, because recent analysis of Barlow's journal, as some of you may have seen in the press a few years ago, showed that actually there was a section of the manuscript that he had covered over, and once revealed, it showed that he raped his wife before they were married, when she was a serving maid in a friend of his in their house. And she then confronted him when she found out that she was pregnant, and he consented to marry her, although apparently he was, some of his friends told him not to because she wasn't very wealthy, and he could have risen to greater heights by marrying someone with wealth to give him the sort of wherewithal to begin shipping. Now, that revelation really kind of turns some of Barlow's glowing praise of his wife on its head. And unfortunately, we don't have any record of what Mary Barlow as she became, what her perspective was. And I think we often think of community as a very positive thing, but actually we need to recognize that negative dimension and that potentially abusive side to some of these relationships. And Margaret Lincoln has shown that in a wider sense in some of the kind of maritime communities related to the Navy as well. But Edward and Mary Barlow do remain married, and they have several children across their lives. And so we have this kind of delicate balance, because it may be that marriage to an East India Company sailor who's gone for a year and a half pretty much every couple of years gives her a degree of independence and a degree of status that she could not have accessed otherwise, certainly as a single pregnant woman in early modern England. But by saying that, I don't want to paint an overly positive picture and try and have a happy ending, when in fact there could have been a very abusive dimension to this relationship as well. But both men do maintain these families, these marriages for the rest of their lives, or their partners' lives. But both have children, both lose children, and Barlow again writes very emotionally about the loss of his children and when he comes home to find that that has happened. And again, it shows the significance and the emotional impact of the relationship for him on of the loss of his children. And in his will, he makes a bequest to his daughter Mary with the proviso that she has to be obedient, obliging, and willing, and to take her mother's advice in all things for her good. So that a lot of this might be kind of the convention of family relationships at this time, but it's also possible that these are really heartfelt, and that it certainly seems from Barlow's journal that the relationships are meaningful, and also from Coxery's journal as well. Barlow concludes his will by willing a long and happy life to my loving wife and children, praying to God that they may all live in his fear and they may all die in his favor. So there's these kind of sentiments which may be conventional, but matched with what he's saying in the journal. I think he does have an emotional tie that's really significant. Both of them, Barlow is married for about 28 years. Coxery is married for about 26 years. Barlow marries a bit later. Barlow marries in his late 30s, whereas Coxery is married in his early 20s. But both of them are married. Barlow's married until he dies, and Coxery is married until his wife dies. And it's clearly a significant part of that phase of their adult lives. And that stage coincides with the career stage that I was talking about earlier, when they are rising to higher responsibilities and to higher opportunities. And I think there's I don't think that's a coincidence that these stages fit so neatly. And so I think that that's part of the point that I'm trying to kind of explore here, is that seafarers' careers and communities are intertwined, and we can see that in the way that the different stages of life develop. So to reach finally to some conclusions, this just quickly is a nice image that I only found a few days ago, but I quite like the way it has an old sailor and a young sailor sitting by the sea, presumably in the Mediterranean, from an Italian artist. Both Barlow and Coxery traveled in the Mediterranean, so it's possible one of them is depicted here, although I think the chances are slim. They were about 10 years difference in age, so it's unlikely that both of them are sitting there together. But I quite like this image of an older sailor talking to a younger sailor, and kind of drawing the attention to the life stages and to the sort of, perhaps the interaction between those life stages as well, that I haven't really touched upon, but I think is quite interesting. So by taking this sort of relatively uninformed perspective on the life cycle and thinking about life stages I've done, I think there are three reflections that I'd like to offer. One is that taking this kind of perspective and using sources like Barlow and Coxery does draw attention to those later stages of the life cycle. And while it doesn't invalidate that stereotype, there are definitely a lot of younger sailors at sea in this period. It reminds us that we have to explore the later stages of the life cycle much more deeply. And I think it's really worth just pausing and reflecting on the wider significance, economic, social, cultural, political significance of those experienced sailors, because without them, the shipping industry simply doesn't work. So it's not just that it's important for their own experiences, but also we see at various pivotal moments in development of the shipping industry, that it's those experienced seafarers who've been at sea for a long time and who've got into the kind of later stages of their life cycle, who are really crucial to these broader developments. The second theme is that it highlights that importance of community, which is something that I've definitely been trying to explore in my work, that distance does not necessarily mean disconnection, that these seafarers do maintain relationships with their families, with their friends, with their neighbors, and that those relationships persist across the course of their life, even while they change and gain particular importance in certain stages, as we might expect. And then the final point is that I think we really need to reflect about the importance of life cycles on the sources themselves, especially when dealing with documents like these. Barlow, as I said, began his journal writing in prison and was clearly in a bad mood, which he stayed in through most of the journal. He then continues to write up the journal probably between each voyage, so it's very episodic, and it kind of is an unfolding, an unfinished narrative, because his ship sinks, so he never actually finishes the journal. Coxery's is written later in life as a memoir, and so it's kind of more coherent. and has more of that reflective quality. And so that might change the way that these two men are describing and representing their experiences. Although it's worth noting also that both of them are probably basing their writings on navigational notes and other kinds of journals. Many sailors would have kept journals as they were traveling at sea, and we can see the influence of those practices of writing going into these autobiographies. And there are other people, particularly Daniel Langer, who've done a lot more work on that than I have. But that does raise one final conundrum for me to conclude on, which is that both of these men are quite unusual. The very fact that they record their experiences makes them very unusual. I think it relates to their very deep religious views, which I haven't had time to speak about, but which also comes manifestly through the journals. And so we have this kind of bind that on the one hand, these are the most rich and wonderful and detailed sources for us to explore these issues with, but we also have to be careful because the very fact that they exist makes them suspect in some ways. So that's not really a manifesto for anyone other than myself, but it's certainly been very useful for me to stop in the middle of the storms and tempests of the current circumstances and think about all of these issues. I hope that it's been useful and interesting to some of those who've come to here tonight, and I'd like to thank you again for all being here. And I think I'll conclude the paper there. Thank you.